Hi guys, welcome back to Elevate Legal. My name's Raoul and I've been part of the team bringing you this series so far, so I certainly hope you've got something out of it. Today's expansion video is going to cover writing tips and how they apply specifically to writing your essays and to your crime 15-mark response. So what we're going to have a look at first of all is where your essay questions come from, how you can apply criteria and sources and put them together to form an awesome paragraph, how to write really nice introductions, how to plan, and how all of this applies both in an essay and to your medium response crime question. So let's get straight into it. By now, I hope it goes without saying that questions come from your syllabus in all of your subjects and particularly in legal studies. But one thing that I want to point out is that at the top of each topic in the legal studies syllabus, there's a section called themes and challenges. In fact, if we go to the syllabus now, I can show you here at the top of the crime syllabus section, it says the principal focus is through the use of the range of contemporary examples, students investigate criminal law, etc., etc. So that is the general takeaway message that the examiners want you to show in your answers. Underneath that, it says themes and challenges to be incorporated. And this is where the bulk of your 15-mark questions in crime and your essay questions in other sections of the paper will come from the themes and challenges section. So for example, you might get a question about the role of law reform in the criminal justice system. And it may be useful for you to have an example of law reform that's happening currently or happened earlier to use if that question comes up. I would certainly go into the exam having thought about each of these themes and challenges, particularly something like the effectiveness of legal and non-legal measures, because that's something that you'll find comes up across the board in all of your essay questions as a theme and challenge. So certainly when you're looking at things that you know will be examined from an essay point of view, make sure you're aware of the themes and challenges because that's where the bulk of your questions will come from. So now that you've understood that, which is quite a critical thing to understand, we can move on to looking at how exactly we construct a paragraph to put into these essays. So the first thing I want to mention is criteria. Now I'm aware that in the bulk of this video series, you would have been introduced to an acronym by the name of ACE-PAIR, which sort of gives you a criteria to measure all of your conclusions against. So I encourage you to go back and look at that video if you aren't aware of what that means. So one of the reasons criteria is so important is because it lets you provide evidence for each of your conclusions. Rather than simply saying, here's a set of facts and here's what I think about it, you're saying, here's a set of facts and here's whether or not those facts meet these different criteria. And because they meet this set of criteria and not this set of criteria, this is the logical conclusion. The other thing it does is it allows you to make value judgments. If one set of facts meets more criteria than another set of facts, then you can logically conclude that the first set is greater than the second set. And it lets you sort of measure both legal and non-legal measures against each other by applying the same criteria. The other thing it lets you do is demonstrate higher order thinking. Now what I mean by that is that often in legal studies, questions will ask you to evaluate or assess, and these are what we call higher order thinking verbs. So that is to say it's more than just a describe or an outline. It requires you to think and analyze and present your conclusions. And by using a set of criteria, you can present those conclusions with sort of an inbuilt structure. So let's say you go into a question, even if we take an essay question or the crime extended response, medium response question, and you look at the question, you go, I have no idea how to answer that. Let's just say that happens, worst case scenario. By having criteria in the back of your mind, it gives you a way to answer any question, even if you have no idea what the substantive matter of the question is. Because just by applying a common sense approach, you can think about each criteria and how it applies to what the question is asking. So if the question asks about bail law reform, for example, and you have no idea what's happened in bail law reform over the last 10 years in New South Wales, then you get in and you think about the first criteria, which is accessibility. And you think about, right, the question's asking you about bail, can I apply accessibility to bail? And just sort of thinking with a legal mind and with a common sense legal approach, you can think about how you can state that bail laws obviously have lots of issues to do with accessibility because people that are applying for bail are applying for their liberty, for their freedom. And they could be people in lower socioeconomic demographics who don't have access to the lawyers to get them the bail and get them the freedom that they deserve before they've actually been proven guilty, before they've been I mean, at that point of bail, they've only been accused of something. So that's a really quick example of how you can take a criteria and it'll give you a way to answer a question you otherwise would have had no way of answering. It also gives you a nice inbuilt structure. Now, I'm a big advocate for dividing your answers into legal and non-legal measures, particularly because the questions largely will ask you to do so. But within the legal and non-legal sections, you can divide each issue up into dealing with the criteria. And when we come back to look at a paragraph, that will become more clear. So it's particularly important when you start out writing an answer that you identify your criteria and put it in your introduction. And generally, I'd say aim for at least 3 to 5 criteria points in an essay and 2 to 3 in your Crime 15 marker, which will keep them at about the relative lengths that they need to be. The other really important thing to use is sources. And sources will supplement your criteria or give evidence to your criteria to make your conclusion. The other reason sources are so important is because it demonstrates to the marker that you have done more work than the average student, and therefore you deserve more marks than the average student, which of course is exactly what we want. Finally, using sources lets you sound like an authority, not just a commentator. Rather than picking up on the facts of a situation and outlining what they've all happened and then providing your opinion, if you back up your opinion with sources, with facts, with evidence, by the end of it, the marker is well and truly convinced that not only have you done lots of research and put lots of work into it, but that you know exactly what you're talking about when you make that conclusion, which is great for your marks. So what we're going to look at now is how we put the criteria and sources together into a real-life example of a paragraph. And I've got there the quick structure that I recommend you use. Start with a topic sentence, put in your criteria, and use sources to back up that criteria and make a conclusion. Now, I should preface this look at a paragraph by saying that I don't think you should use all 5 criteria that you've chosen in every single paragraph. I think you should structure your paragraphs based on issues and select the criteria that best relates to your issue. And you can even be a little bit clever about it. If you do your planning well and you know where you want your essay to conclude, you know what your conclusion is going to be, then you can select the criteria that relates to that issue that lets you conclude in that way. Now that sounds a little bit vague, so let's have a look at a real life example of a question here. So this is a quick paragraph. It's not a full paragraph, it's about half a paragraph that I've written up in answer to a mock question on the world order topic about state sovereignty. So there's a couple of things that I want to start by pointing out. The very first thing is that this very first sentence introduces the issue that I want this paragraph to address. And the issue is that states can impede the influence of international law by using their sovereignty. Okay, remember this is an essay about state sovereignty. I'm obviously going to be talking about positive and negative points. So the very first sentence is the topic sentence. It says exactly what I'm going to be talking about in that paragraph. The next sentence provides an example to expand on exactly what I've just said I'm going to talk about. So it says the Permanent Five, members of the UNSC, often block resolutions with a unique veto power when their own interests are concerned. For example, China blocking United Nations action in Darfur due to its oil interests in Sudan. And then, as you can see, I provided a source. Now, the way I've sourced this is quite important. I've provided Global Policy Forum, which is the full name, the abbreviation GPF, only because I know that I'm going to be using this source again later in the essay, and the year that it was found. So you can see here I've stated the point, I've illustrated it with a strong example, and I've sourced that example where I've got it from. I haven't just made it up off the top of my head. And here's where I'm going to relate that back to the criteria. Refusal to sign treaties and a lack of cooperation and support for United Nations initiatives are a clear barrier to world order. And there we go. Barrier to world order is another key sentence, and it's a criteria that I would have mentioned in the introduction. I would have said that one of the aims of world order is to facilitate international law and world order. So being a barrier is obviously not satisfying that criteria. Continuing, it says representing the failure of international law to be enforceable or to uphold the rule of law. Again, that's 2 more criteria. And you can see here that I've not needed to provide too much more substantive explanation of the criteria. I'm simply stating that because of the evidence I've just shown you, that is the example in China, I can now say that international law fails in this case to be enforceable, to uphold equality across nations, because obviously the Permanent Five have more power than the rest, and that represents a barrier to world order. And then I finish this part of the point by saying, again, evidence in Syria between 2011 and 14, when they utilized their sovereignty to prevent the international intervention despite the mass atrocity crimes. And again, I've sourced it as Genocide Watch. So that gives you sort of a succinct explanation of how all of these factors come together to form a paragraph. And you can see that if you have those considerations in mind, it becomes much easier to structure a paragraph. Rather than thinking about, oh, what comes next? What do I need to say now? You think about, I've made the point. Let's provide some examples, link them back to criteria, maybe another example, and make another substantive point. And if you continue like that throughout your paragraphs, you're going to find it far, far easier to write them. So let's get back to where we were, and let's have a look at introductions. Now, there's a reason I've left this to after mentioning the criteria. I think your introductions are a critical part of your essay. Without a good introduction, the marker will forever feel like there's no flow and like you didn't really know what you were talking about when you started out. And that really ties into your planning, which we'll come to in a second. So the way I like to explain introductions is with an upside down triangle. I think all introductions across your subjects, but particularly in legal studies, should start out wide and vague, like the top of a triangle, and narrow into specifically the criteria you're going to use to answer the question. So the very first thing I like to put in an introduction are definitions. I'll define the topic, I'll define the specific things that I'm going to be talking about in the topic. So going back to the paragraph that we just looked at, I would define what world order is, I would define what state sovereignty is, I would define anything else necessary in the question. I would then provide a roadmap, which is sort of the middle of the triangle, where you bring in those definitions and you apply them to what you're going to answer. And you give the marker an understanding of what's coming next. So a roadmap would be something like, I would spell out the issues that I'm going to talk about. So in the state sovereignty case, I would say, for example, this essay will examine the legal and non-legal measures going towards state sovereignty and assess whether or not state sovereignty upholds the rule of law or whether or not state sovereignty is a successful concept. So that sort of provides a roadmap dissecting each issue that I'll be talking about. And then I'll flow into the criteria and I'll say this assessment will be made by reference to criteria such as whether or not it upholds the rule of law, whether or not it is a barrier to the attainment of world order ideals, whether or not it upholds resource efficiency, encourages interaction between states, etc., 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 whatever criteria I've chosen on the day. So what this lets you do is it lets you, first of all, have a really good idea in your own mind of exactly what you need to write. Once you've written the introduction, if you ever get lost, you go back to the introduction and you say, where am I up to and what criteria am I using to prove it? And it also gives the marker that exact same feeling. It gives the feeling that this kid knows exactly what they're talking about before they start. They're going to prove it using really great sources. I really have no choice but to give them great marks. And that's, of course, exactly what we want. So this obviously all ties into planning, and I think the most critical element of planning is deciding on the position you want to take before you start writing anything. So when you see a question, so for example, if it says, evaluate the effectiveness of legal and non-legal measures in relation to state sovereignty, you look at that and you go, right, do I want to say state sovereignty is doing well or doing badly? That's the very first thing you need to decide. So let's say we want to say that state sovereignty has a lot of potential, but at the moment is more of a hindrance than it is a success. Good, so we've decided on the position. Then for essays, based on your position, you're going to select the paragraphs and issues that you'll use. Now the reason that I've written it this way is because the way that I approached legal studies was that I wrote a bunch of paragraphs on a whole lot of different issues. I learnt the sources that related to those issues, and then I went into the exam. And therefore, when I saw the question and I decided my position, I could simply select the paragraphs that best suited that position and then write them into my essay. So that's the way I personally chose to do it, and I think it is a good way of doing it. For your medium response for your crime question, I suggest you write down each of the issues that you want to talk about that will prove your position, and underneath each issue, jot down the source, the case, or the legislation that you're going to use to back it up. And when you're doing that, obviously don't write the whole paragraph out, use trigger words. So use one or two words that when you're in the exam and maybe you forget about them, will bring back to your mind exactly what you wanted to put in each paragraph. Now, next to this video, I'm going to attach a resource, which is sort of a structure that gives you a bunch of different questions that could come up in the crime extended response, and it sort of dissects how I'd apply each syllabus dot point. And you'll see I've often just taken direct syllabus dot points and applied them, and in what order I'd apply them to construct my essay. So really what that document is what I would try and produce as a plan in the exam before I even started going into it. And it's certainly a resource that you can use now going forward into the year. The way I'd suggest doing that is to, for each point that's there on the plan, make sure you find yourself a source, a case, of legislation, and understand what the point is trying to tell you. So more specifically in relation to the Crime 15 marker, other things that will help you are knowing the flow of the syllabus well. Now, when I say flow of the syllabus, I refer you back to a video that I did previously, which will go through exactly what I mean by the flow and how it gives you an inbuilt structure. Because again, when you look at a question and you think you have no idea how to answer it, the best thing you can do is find yourself a structure where you can just apply common sense things, or things that you do know, and make them sound like they relate to the topic. So if you know how the syllabus flows and you know where that question fits into the topics in the syllabus and in the order of the syllabus, then you can write about topics on either side of it and tie them in, because you might have more knowledge of those topics than the one in the question. The other thing I'd suggest is preparing 1 to 2 key topics, and this comes back to those themes and challenges that we looked at earlier. For example, going into my HSC exam, I had an essay written up on bail law reform prepared, and I'd learnt, not word for word, but all the sources and main ideas that I wanted to talk about. And that's what I call a key topic. I recognize that the rest of the themes and challenges and the rest of the questions that I had seen, I could largely answer sort of on the spot based on my knowledge, based on the sources that I had. But something like law reform, for me, needed a far more specific case study. So I did choose to prepare that. And in the notes that I'm going to put up next to this video, you'll see that there's other case study and key topic things that have been included, such as the Yugoslavian case, and you can have a look at those yourself. And I think that's a really good way of doing it, particularly if you can identify what's happening in society and what contemporary issues are happening around you now. Because examiners in legal studies love to write questions based on what's happening now. When I did the HSC, bail law reform was a massive issue. It was a big controversy, both politically and legally. So it's really no surprise that that was the question that we got in our exams. So think about it that way, and I encourage you to have some more specific resources prepared for those types of topics. In general, like I just said, know a source, a case, and a legislation where you can find one for every single topic in crime, and if you can, for most of the dot points in crime as well. Because at least that will let you feel like you can answer any question with authority. And it's providing those sources that will get you more marks than waffling along without backing anything you're saying up. So in general, I want you to follow the tips that I've provided on introduction and paragraphs for essays, but use less criteria and therefore shorten the length of your response, because you don't want to be spending an hour writing your crime response. So I'd say in your introduction, specify your roadmap, do your definitions, then your roadmap, and then say you're going to assess that roadmap in relation to 2 to 3 criteria. Write 2 to 3 paragraphs with each with a different issue, and apply 2 to 3 criteria to each paragraph, and then conclude saying, on the balance of these criteria, this shows this particular position. Alright guys, so that's the end of today's video. I really hope you've got something out of it. As always, if you've got any other questions or comments or anything you need answered, post it up under the video or on the Elevate website, and a member of the team will definitely get back to you. Until next time guys, good luck.